Good evening, everybody. Uneducated economist here. So in this video, we are going to talk about how it is Jerome Powell is being used as a cover-up, or at least a distraction away from what it is that I believe is the bigger issue taking place at the Federal Reserve. Now, those of you who have followed me on my channel for any length of time, you've heard me talk about the credible threat theory and the idea that the Federal Reserve is pushing for an elevated inflation expectation to get elevated interest rates and to ultimately raise something called the neutral interest rate. Now, those things are very complicated to understand and to think about what it is that they had said within their statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategies. This is how it is that they conduct themselves, and most people miss these words within this statement. They came right out and said it many times, and they have not tried to hide this from anybody, but yet when you listen to the mainstream media, it is very different from what it is that they have communicated here within this statement. So I'm not reading the whole thing. I just want to read a little section of it so we can understand what it is that they are about ready to change, or at least what I feel is about ready to change. Committee has the ability to specify the long-run goals for inflation. The committee reaffirms its judgment that the inflation at a rate of 2% as measured by the annual change in the price index of personal consumption expenditures is most consistent over the long run with the Federal Reserve statutory mandate. The committee judges that long-term inflation expectations that are well anchored at 2% foster price stability and moderate long-term interest rates and enhance the committee's ability to promote maximum employment in the face of significant economic disturbances. Now, this is where it gets important. In order to anchor long-term inflation expectation at this level, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, and therefore judges that following period when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. Now, to understand that this is the monetary policy that they had set into motion 5 years ago. Here we are sitting in a position in which that inflation is moderately above 2%. The reason why they did this was to get a long-term average inflation rate of 2%. It even says right here, in order to anchor long-term inflation expectations at this level, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. That's what they were shooting for. So prior to COVID and post the Great Financial Crisis, the Federal Reserve's inflation measures, right? Whether or not you want to believe them or not, that's entirely up to you. And I totally get it if you don't want to believe it. But if you want to understand what they're doing with monetary policy, then you have to kind of take what they are looking at into consideration, right? I mean, it's just like whether you want to believe it or not, that's entirely up to you. And I totally get it if you don't want to. However, the Federal Reserve is looking at inflation measures that were running consistently below 2%. They had a very difficult time getting that inflation scenario above the 2% target that they were looking for, which meant that they had to do something to create an inflationary scenario that would then elevate that interest rate or that inflation rate above the 2% target, which would then in turn regain their ammo that they were looking for. Now, I know this is all very complicated, but to think about it being written in this consensus statement back in, when was this reaffirmed? Reaffirmed effective January 30th of 2024. So it wasn't that long ago that they stated this, right? I mean, originally people looked at the 2% target as what the Federal Reserve's goal was like their entire time. That's not true. It's only really been since 2012 that they took on this 2% target. Until then, they just adjusted rates as they felt needed and with no real target rate. That came in back in the 2012 era where they were trying to deal with an inflationary scenario in which that they were like, hey, they essentially couldn't find the inflationary scenario, and they were pushing the economy with this idea that they were going to hit this 2% target. This is the crazy thing about it. They never achieved it. They never once achieved the 2% target, not the entire time they were doing it. I mean, they hit it a couple of times, but never consistently were they at 2%. So I don't know why it is that people think that they can do it now. They've never done it in the past, and so therefore I don't believe that they could ever do it in the future. However, they can go for a long-term average inflation rate. Unfortunately, they don't give us any measure of what this average inflation rate over time is. And so that is also stated within their own speeches, coming directly from Jerome Powell, who stated this August 27th of 2020 in a speech that he had given. You now leave links down in the description for it. In fact, here, let me just bring it up for you real quick. Just give me 1 second. I can do this. But to understand that they had this planned essentially well in advance, and I've tried to prove that many times through the credible threat theory. Now, let's bring up Jerome Powell's speech here real quick. This is August 27th of 2020. And now, in this speech, he really does say it almost as clear as could possibly be. What he is talking about here is when the 2% target cannot be achieved, like they cannot even get to the 2% target, right? He says this: "We also have made important changes with regard to price stability side of our mandate. Our long-run goal continues to be inflation rate of 2%, the long-run goal, right? Just much like we talked about here in this consensus statement. Our statement emphasizes that our actions to achieve both sides of our dual mandate will be most effective if long-term inflation expectations, remember the expectations, are well anchored at 2%. However, if inflation runs below 2% following economic downturns, great financial crisis, right? Inflation ran below 2%. However, if inflation runs below 2% following economic downturns, but never moves above 2% even when the economy is strong, again, this is exactly what happened after the great financial crisis all the way leading up until 2018, and never moves above 2% even when the economy is strong, then over time, inflation averages less than 2%. Households and businesses will come to expect this result, meaning that inflation expectations would tend to move below our inflation goal and pull realized inflation down." Did you hear this? See, this is the problem that the Federal Reserve was facing in 2020, August 27th of 2020. Households and businesses will come to expect this result, meaning that inflation expectations would tend to move below our inflation goal and pull realized inflation down. To prevent this outcome and adverse dynamics that could ensue, our new statement, this is the statement on long-run goals, right? This is the one that's going to be changing here very soon. Our new statement indicates that we will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Therefore, following periods when inflation has been running below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. Again, right? Think about what it is that's happening right now with inflation. We have CPI, all the other things consistently running above 2%, moderately above 2% for some time. This is exactly what it is that the Federal Reserve said that they wanted back in 2020. Okay. In seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, this is crazy, guys. This is absolutely the craziest part right here. In seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, we are not tying ourselves to a particular mathematical formula that defines the average. Thus, our approach could be viewed as a flexible form of average inflation targeting. Our decision about appropriate monetary policy will continue to reflect a broad array of considerations and will not be dictated by any formula. This is why I think it's so critical that we focus in on what it is that the Federal Reserve is going to do with this statement on long-run goals. This consensus statement, right? What do they call it? I always forget it. It's the statement on long-run goals and strategies. Dang it! I always mess it up when I don't have it here written right in front of me. It is dang it. Oh, never mind, computer just crashed on me. But that's okay, we're at the end of the video anyway. But to understand that the Federal Reserve is now setting up to change this statement, that they are going to change the way that they view inflation, how it is, or they may not too. I mean, that's the whole thing. They may not change it, right? And this may stay the entire time. And so as people are still considering them trying to get down to a 2% target, and right now the statement is literally stating that they are not doing that, right? Then we can understand what it is that we need to do with ourselves and our goals and our ideas of what it is that we are going to position ourselves in accordance to how they are setting the monetary policy. Because what they are doing is either making the policy restrictive or accommodating. And to understand that's the position that the Federal Reserve takes. A lot of times people are like, they're manipulative in all kinds of stock markets and real estate and governments and politics and all this other stuff. And it's just like, wow, okay, yeah, that's a lot to carry. But what they're really doing is they're trying to either ease or restrict the financial conditions. And now to understand how it is that they can ease and restrict financial conditions, simply done by the expectations of the people and where it is that they feel inflation is going to be going into the future. This is the key to understanding the monetary policy today. Because if you notice that they don't really do much, right? I mean, when they adjusted interest rates, they did them very fast. They shot interest rates up as quickly as possible. And then they stalled out and they didn't do anything, right? They did drop a little bit, but they haven't really done much. And although the promise and the expectations of future rate cuts are there, the expectation of those rate cuts has a profound impact on the economy, on the markets, on the behavior of the people. And to understand how it is that they use that to manipulate the people is actually communicated within their own statements. This is something that we here on The Uneducated Economist have tried to share through the credible threat theory, and how it is that they are actually doing this. So now, again, I say, as people are looking at Jerome Powell being the problem, the Trump is pointing the finger at him, saying he's too late, he's a moron, blah, 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 and look at what he did with this whole renovation, look at this, look at this, look at this. Meanwhile, they're about ready to make this change to their statement. How many people know this? Very few. How many people even know that these words are written within this statement? How many people are like considering what it is that's going to be changing within this statement when it comes to their own decision making? Because there is going to be a lot that happens if there is going to be a change to the way that they view this 2% target. This elevated inflation expectation to raise what I believe is the neutral interest rate. If you raise this neutral interest rate while the Federal Reserve is standing still and that neutral interest rate gets ever closer to the Fed funds rate, the economy becomes less restrictive. This is the key to understanding what's going on within the economy. This is through their own words, too. This isn't me. For those of you who didn't quite believe me that this is still part of their policy, this elevated inflation, this moderately above 2%, this is a statement coming out of, what is this? This is to Congress. This is the Monetary Policy Report issued February 7th of 2025. So again, for those who thought that maybe the speech from 2020 is just 5 years old and it doesn't mean anything anymore, this is what it says in this report. This is to Congress just a few months ago, right? In February. The inflation rate over the long run is primarily determined by monetary policy, and hence the committee has the ability to specify the long-run goals for inflation. The committee reaffirms its judgment that inflation at the rate of 2% as measured by the annual change in the price index for personal consumption expenditures is most consistent over the long run. Remember that, over the long run. With the Federal Reserve statutory mandate, the committee judges that the long-term inflation expectations that are well anchored at 2%, right? Not the 2% target, not an inflation at 2%, but inflation expectations that are well anchored at 2%. There's a difference between those two. Anchored at 2%, foster price stability and moderate long-term interest rates, and hence the committee's ability to promote maximum employment in the face of significant economic disturbances. In order to anchor long-term inflation expectation at this level, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, and therefore judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. So again, this is coming directly from the Federal Reserve in a report to Congress given February of 2025. This is not that old. For those who believe that the Fed was attempting to get to a 2% target, got it wrong. That's not what they were doing. They said it over and over again. We are actually trying not to do that. We are trying to keep an elevated inflation and inflation expectation in order to raise they didn't say it in here, but in order to raise the neutral interest rate. Appropriate monetary policy was seeking to achieve an average inflation rate over time. Average inflation rate over time has no mathematical formula for figuring it out. Jerome Powell said that. You put these all together and you think about why it is that they did it in this fashion, gave an elevated inflation expectations, right, in order to raise the neutral interest rate, anchor those long-term inflation expectations at 2%, make sure that it's there. Now you have a position in which that you can now use your words to adjust monetary policy in accordance to where the neutral interest rate is to the Fed funds rate. This is so complicated for a lot of people, I understand, and I can only put so much in a 15-minute video. Uneducated economist, you guys let me know. Links are down in the description.